Hi, welcome to week 7. This week's focus is on family multiliteracies. Our team has been working very hard on this particular week, where we have professionally captured videos of families throughout the Midwest and are representative of families from your school districts. And so you may see some familiar faces, but we enter into the homes with great sacredness, going into the spaces of our children's homes and learning about how families view bilingualism, language, and literacies. And you will see here the definition of multiliteracies and how this can be instructive to us as teachers in our classroom of English learners, as you'll see here in these videos, more appropriately framed emergent bilinguals. So let's take a closer look. Multiliteracies. So this term has been around since the mid-90s. You'll see here a group of scholars from around the world that had similar but slightly different foci, but many being in colleges of education, linguistics, and anthropology, where they endeavored to examine the changing definition of literacy and specifically the changing definition of languages, and that we can't just be focused on literacy looking one way, but that we need to think more inclusively of the cultural, linguistic, communicative, and technological diversity, not just as skills, but resources that our children bring to the class. So this is them dressed very groovily in the mid-1990s. You can tell by their attire. And of course, at this time, these scholars are some of them have actually retired, but have gone on to talk extensively about multiliteracies. But this is why they call themselves the New London Group. They met in New London, New Hampshire, and basically created this seminal paper that is informing the field today. So multiliteracies takes us a step farther than just thinking about literacies in a one-dimensional format.
Thanks, Emily and Jeannie, for your additions and thinking about multiliteracies. As you all talked about that, I didn't hear you mention the term school. And so I think this is significant in the sense that multiliteracies really transcends a lot of times what happens in schools, because many times in schools we aren't necessarily aware of the different cultural and linguistic and communicative and technological diversity in our classroom, or that we maybe know that it's happening, but it's something that happens out there. So thanks for recognizing that this is something that is uniquely situated in homes and communities.
So I've already described the cultural, linguistic, communicative, and technological resources that our children bring to school. But to talk about this more simply, what happens in homes is of significance and of value to the child and to the family. And those values that children bring to schools are important cultural resources that are to be understood within schools instead of squashed or ignored. Oftentimes, we are not aware of the multiliteracies that our children bring to school. And that's the purpose of the project that we just recently did on the interviews with our families and your analysis forthcoming. So multiliteracies really helps us shift things on its head from looking at different languages and literacies as a deficit that takes away and looking at things more additively and how students can contribute uniquely to school. But it's incumbent upon us as educators to think about how those differences can be incorporated.
I think what all of you are hitting upon is that multiliteracies is not something that we measure and quantify. It is not something fixed, but it's something dynamically constructed and valued within their home and community contexts. And we sometimes get a glimpse into this. And I'm glad that the assignment that you've done in interviewing your family has given you sort of a purview into this. And I know that we live in the world of accountability, and we can sometimes feel very constrained by that. But in what ways can we identify and recognize that multiliteracies are happening despite all of this? and that these are the rich resources that our families have. So, when you think about all the rich resources that our kids have, in what ways do we include those in schools? And some of you alluded to how you've done that through literature, through food. And I wonder, like, what do we do with sort of exchanges with kids across different linguistic and racial backgrounds?
So let's take a look at these two columns. You'll see on the left-hand side is the traditional or autonomous definition of literacy in language, meaning it's fixed, it's one-dimensional, and it's just text. And the scholars from the New London group suggest that literacy in language is dynamic and fluid, it's negotiated, it's multidimensional, and it's also multimodal, meaning it can be expressed in a lot of different ways, including technological, in languages other than English, and in languages that that maybe are not necessarily linguistic, other forms of expression as well. So this is a clearer definition of what multiliteracies claims to be with the things that are on the right-hand side. Think about your schools, think about the homes of your families, and where do these intersect and where do they perhaps collide or conflict?
I can connect this to the Mal, Lamonti, Neff, and Gonzalez article that we read on the Funds of Knowledge for Teaching. It made me think of specifically when it was talking about the relationships that are discovered through the multiliteracies approach, being that when we look at a child's relationship with an adult or a peer inside of their home, it tends to be, they use the word thick. So they gave the example of how an uncle might be their uncle in their family. It might be the mechanic that fixes their cars, and he might also be the person that goes fishing with their father every Friday. So there's multi modes of that relationship, and that relationship is multidimensional in the way that they know them in different contexts, versus the relationship that they tend to have with teachers, which is the word they used is thin. It made me think about how I feel that language is more multidimensional and multimodal inside of homes, just in general. And I don't know that there's anything wrong with the fact that inside of school it's more unidimensional, because it does need to serve a specific purpose. However, I think that the avenues that we take to get students to arrive to that academic language can become more multidimensional, and we can open up more pathways to make that presentation of literacy and language more accessible for our families and more relatable.
Stephanie, I also found that idea of thick relationships, multi stranded relationships, interesting when I was reading the text. And I think about the fact that we as a school tell our parents that the parents are partners. And I extend that even further and talk to parents many times about you're the expert on your child. You know a whole lot more about your child than I do, especially at the beginning of the year. Um, they know them in a multi-lensed way. They see all those aspects. They know their past. So I can use that information that the parents provide to best be the best teacher I can for that individual student. And I think it's so important that we have that partnership. It made me think about the idea of um, looping grade levels with students. And I've never had that experience myself, but I wonder if getting to know this child, um, what we sometimes call the below the line information, getting to know that child deeply beyond just as a learner, might be uh, beneficial to have them for multiple years, and see them grow. So just something that I'm kind of thinking about as I look at this text and think about what that might mean for us.
Stephanie, Jeannie, and LaMonica, you talk about being in a STEM-focused school and how your principal is working with, I think she's one of my colleagues from Purdue, where when I think about your mission and in talking to your principal, one of the things that is really central to your mission is this whole notion of create. And create is not just text on the page, being able to read from left to right, being able to sound things out, being able to make predictions and inferences, right? There's so much more to that. But we tend to really be super hyper focused on what's on the left because it's what's testable and measurable, right? But over here, I think the beauty of this over here is that it's not countable, it's not fixed, it's not measured. And really, this connects very deeply to the children's enjoyment, engagement, and even more specifically to their identities. And so much time, a lot of times in schools, because we spend so much time on this, we don't really always recognize these components of creativity that our students are really doing every day.
So why is it important to think about literacy more fluidly and not as being fixed and standardized? This is really the construction we often do in schools. Language looks like this, language is expressed like this, literacy is this, and you must master it by this time, right? Very, very standardized. And so if there is one standard, then what that does is it suggests that other expressions of language and literacy are non-standard. And if they're non-standard, the tendency is to drive our focus on the deficits and remediating those deficits out of children. The other thing that this does is if we construct literacy and languages in this way, what it does is it says that schools are better at it than the families. And that is really, really hard for me to say. But this is something that often schools know best instead of parents know best. And that's something that I want you to really seriously think about. The biggest thing that happens when we have this literacy is fixed mentality, or the myth of this, is it really diminishes opportunities for something we call reciprocity. Reciprocity is an equal relationship between the teacher and the parent. And oftentimes this is something we need to foster, and it takes time. And I hope that through your case studies, you've gotten to know a family a little bit better. And through this, you have a window into their world that can create a flatter line of communication that can serve as a model for other families that you approach throughout your school year and throughout your career as an educator. So think about this. How do we in schools construct language and literacy? What have been some of your shifts around language and literacy since starting this program? And what are the implications for you as a teacher among your English learners?
I feel a similar way, not quite the same exact experience, but so I interviewed my focal student's family last week, and it was such a cool experience doing the interview. And I learned that one of her concerns is that she sends her child to school to learn English, and she's really excited and loves how our school does things, but she fears that he'll become confused if she uses too much Spanish at home. So that really shows me and empowers me to encourage our kids even more. Like I have to put a lot more effort out and make sure that they feel comfortable. I already have kids that talk to each other. When we play games and stuff, they'll talk to each other in Spanish, but I need to incorporate it more in the actual lesson planning. This last lesson plan, I found the Spanish words for the math words that I was introducing, and they thought that was really cool. And I feel like I just need to make sure that I'm making the effort to do that all the time. And like you said, having the students answer in their L1. And even though I don't speak the L1, I think that's why, obviously why wasn't encouraging it before is because I don't understand Spanish mostly. But, the kids can feel empowered if they're answering in Spanish and then translating for me. I think that's something that needs to happen in my class now. And that's going to help out families. Like, my focal students family who says that she's afraid of confusing the students. Well, if I put the power in the classroom to show that, it's okay and you should be speaking Spanish, you should use this asset that you have, that they'll be more likely to go home and use it, because I'm finding that almost all of my families, the siblings are speaking exclusively English to each other, and their parents want them to retain that Spanish, but they're just not responding anymore using it. They can understand it. They're not able to really read it. And some of them are losing the ability to say words in their L1 too. So it needs to come from us at school, and we definitely are not the experts. As we found with the interviews, there are all different kinds of dynamics that we need to honor and encourage.
I just relate so much to hearing these other comments and voice threads, because I feel like I have so many of the same opinions and feelings. And especially when I first started teaching, I had no idea that these kids weren't speaking Spanish at home. I just thought that was, something that was making it more difficult, is because they were speaking so much Spanish at home, they were having a hard time retaining the English. But the more I talk to parents in my Spanish speaking families, they tell me, I can speak to my kid in Spanish, but they're not speaking back to me. And it makes me sad, because sometimes I feel like they think they have to speak in English. And sometimes I think if they've lost a little bit of the Spanish and they can understand it, but they're not confident enough to speak it. My interview I learned so much about one of my little kiddos. It was amazing. He had to go to speech therapy as a kid because he was not speaking. Up until the age of 2, he refused to talk. And so they put him in some speech therapy. And because he was in speech therapy, his therapist only spoke English. So he was only being taught English in therapy, and the only time he was talking was in therapy. So that kind of caused a difference in dynamic. And for a while, he could not speak to his father because his father only spoke Spanish. So that's part of why his mother put him in this dual language program, is because she feels like he really has to catch up to kind of keep up with the rest of the family. She has older teen boys, and she has to encourage them to speak Spanish. And it surprised me, because she talked about how much she has to encourage to be bilingual, and tell them over and over how many opportunities that they're going to get by being bilingual. So to me, I'm jealous of someone who's bilingual, but to them, they're not as interested. They don't think it's as big of a deal. They just think it's more important to learn English. And actually, when I talked to my teaching partner, who comes from Spain, when we talk about getting jobs in other countries or teaching different languages, she always tells me like how lucky I am that I am a native English speaker, because I could go anywhere and teach. They want native English speakers. I'm like, no, you're the lucky one. You are bilingual. Actually, she's trilingual, and you have all these languages that you can teach and speak so well. And it's crazy how opposite we feel about that. I feel like she is totally, has the upper hand by being trilingual, and she looks at me and says that I have an upper hand because I'm a native English speaker. So just by talking to different people, you learn so much and see so many different sides.
I wanted to comment on reciprocity, and I wanted just to talk about how important it is for you to have that equal relationship with your parents, for them to trust you enough to come to you and speak to you. And I'm fortunate enough to say that I have that with many of my Hispanic parents that live here in Logansport, Indiana. And I'm glad that through these case studies, people are the teachers that are in this course, are fostering, maybe starting to foster them if they didn't have them, and seeing how important it is. And it's in the articles, we are learning about, funds of knowledge. There's just so much that these Hispanics parents are teaching their kids at home that maybe they don't think are English teachers, or language arts teachers, or a teacher might not think that they're getting things at home. But there's just so much going on, and just these articles highlight the different things that it might not be their mom, it might be their uncle, their grandma, their grandparents, but they're teaching them to do things that are just, unbelievably awesome. I if it wasn't for my grandma, I wouldn't be a good cook. If it wasn't for, and being able to, do recipes, just different things. I mean, your families are important, and we need to make sure that they feel that they're equal to you. And it's like Trish was saying, you learn at home first. So I really enjoyed the readings this week. I wanted to comment on what Courtney was talking about, how she was surprised about how little Spanish that a lot of the Hispanics are speaking at home. And honestly, that's something that has always flustered me, but I think it's because when I was a child, my father always made sure that we didn't lose our culture and our language, our native language. And he made it his task to take us to Mexico every summer for 2 months to make sure that we didn't lose it, but also installed the importance of being respectful to the teachers here and learning English. But I've always been, of a loss of words to see, how many students do not practice their Spanish at home. How many parents come to me and say, they are losing their Spanish, and that they're grateful for this program where they can continue to learn in both languages. But it also reminds me of EDCI530, what Dr. Trish, when you talked about how quickly the students realize what the dominant language is, and they speak it more. So that instantly clicked in my head as Courtney was talking about how she was amazed at how many don't speak Spanish at home. So it's something that happens a lot, unfortunately.
So when you were talking about this slide, it really, the idea of having equal reciprocity between the families and the schools really stuck out for me. And it was because of something that my focal student's mother said when I interviewed her for our last assignment. There was a question on there that said something along the lines of, what do you want your child's teacher to know about teaching my child reading and writing? I think it was something like that. And she kind of hesitated, and she said, well, I'm not going to give advice to my child's teacher. Like, you're my child's teacher. You know what she needs to learn. And I did prompt her again after that, are you sure? Like, there's nothing that you want to tell me? And she was very adamant about, no, you're my child's teacher. Like, what's best for her. I'm not going to, I feel like she saw it as a disrespect thing to kind of tell me how to do my job in her mind or something like that. And that goes back to what you said about the viewpoint that schools know best. And I feel like she definitely had that mindset when she was talking to me. Because although she told me, she works on homework with her daughter and she reads with her daughter and she does all kinds of things to help her daughter, now, I guess, reflecting back on that conversation, she was not holding that with nearly as much weight as she was holding what I do with her daughter here at school. And even, she was telling me when she was talking to me about in what ways she helps her daughter with homework and things like that. She was talking to me about reading the little leveled readers that I send home for homework every week with her child, and that sometimes her child gets a little confused about what they're talking about in the book or the concept that they're talking about or something. So she'll explain it in Spanish. And I remember thinking when she told me that, she kind of hesitated before she told me that, almost like she wasn't sure if she should tell me that she helped her in Spanish. Because it was an English reading book. And I told her actually that's great because, you're just, helping her understand the content of the book. And I told her also that, if she has, struggles with reading or struggles with, a paper she brings home or something that she might've struggled on, the skills that we are learning in English transfer over to Spanish. So if she helps her or, re-explain something to her in Spanish, that it's only a benefit to her. And she was really thankful that I had told her that. And I guess that had not ever been said to her before. So I know that as a teacher, I need to definitely encourage my families more in that way and help them know that I want to view this as a partnership and not as, school being I guess the only leader in their child's language development.
I immediately thought of this reciprocity as well, because I have found that even though I am using most of my students' first language, doing bilingual education, I would assume, if you just gave me a hypothetical, oh, those people are more involved, right? They feel more connected. They don't feel like there's a language barrier. But yet, as a school, we see more involvement from parents that are non-Hispanic. And we have gotten feedback recently from families that says, we don't think it is as easy to be represented, even though we have a school that's half the population is Spanish speaking, and most of our teachers are Spanish speaking. So it's not just a language barrier. It's definitely the way schools are set up and the way that things are presented. And we've been working on that, like as a culture, just to make ourselves more inviting and make ourselves more available. I do find that a lot of my Spanish speaking parents will do exactly what someone commented before, where they're like, well, you're the teacher, or, I don't want to disrespect you, or, they will say, excuse me, I'm not trying to disrespect you, but this happened. And even when they're just reporting something that their child saw in the classroom, and I'm like, oh no, never feel bad bringing something to me. I'm here to help your child. That is my job. I want to help. And I try really hard to create that culture that invites them in, rather than defining, we are better as the teacher. But I see that a lot, like, oh, you would know, or oh, do what your teacher says. Your teacher, she knows best, that kind of thing. And they'll even say, like, anything you need, let me know, whatever I can support you with. I don't have any questions. And I find that a lot of my non-Hispanic parents will come in and be like, with questions, or they want to know, well, why did you do it this way? And then we can start a dialogue, and I can say, more easily, I guess, here's why I do this, whereas the other parents don't often challenge me. And that's still something we're all, at least for me, I'm very personally working on, because I want to invite them in and I want to know that background knowledge. I feel like, especially in kindergarten, we talk about the funds of knowledge. I want to know all the background stuff. I want to know, why that child might be off the wall tonight. Maybe they didn't sleep, even stuff like that, let alone, the things that they can do at home and the things they help out with and things that help in kindergarten to help tie into the classroom. If that child loves to help out at home, I know they're going to be a great helper in class, and I can use that to help engage them. All of that background stuff is so important.
Listening to these comments on reciprocity is really making me reflect on myself and my classroom. Before this, I would have been like, yep, got reciprocity. I make sure that my parents know that they can let me know anything that's going on, that I value what they bring to the table for their child's education. We're good. But the more I thought about this as I listened to Alex's responses about how all of the different family members and the cultural background that those family members are bringing into the child's life that make up the total child, listening to Ellen's response about how the parent was reluctant to give advice to the language arts teacher because they are the teacher and she's just the mother. It really makes me think about how this idea of reciprocity, my approach to it might need to be readjusted, because I don't know as if my parents feel quite as welcome as maybe I would hope. I also wonder in this, one of the things that the parent I interviewed talked about was that she was born here in the United States herself, and that she was raised speaking both English and Spanish in her home. And I wonder how that changes when we're looking at a first generation, a parent raising a first generation American citizen versus a parent raising a second, third, or even farther generation child. So I guess how Americanized the family is and how that changes the family's approach to the school. Um, this parent that I interviewed, she was right there at the beginning of the year talking about, oh, well, my child is involved in things. He needs to be involved in them. I'll let you know if he can't get work done. Whereas I've got other parents that have been like, school's going to come first, and you let me know what we need to be doing at home. So, I just wonder how those dynamics change dependent on some of the different cultural backgrounds of the families, but also based on the length of time that family unit has been in the United States.
Hi, everybody. I think everybody is really talking about this term called reciprocity. And that is really different than thinking I've communicated with my parents, I have connected with them, one and done. But it's really about sort of learning from them about how they are their child's first teacher and how that can inform what we do. I think a lot of times we ascribe to the parent as the first teacher when they reflect the culture and the language from which we come from, because that's something that is known. It is considered normal. It is how we grew up. It's familiar. And when we meet the unfamiliar with families that have different language and cultural backgrounds and even socioeconomic backgrounds than we do, had as children growing up, it really flips our perspective. And so I'm glad that the activity of interviewing your family has revealed that. The second thing I want to talk about is this whole notion of language shift, because what a lot of you are noticing is that there is dramatic shift in the households when the kids enter school. And for those of you that have a child in your classroom who has older siblings, the shift is even more dramatic. If the kid is older, the shift happens more slowly. But if the kid is the youngest, the shift happens very quickly. Meaning once all the kids are in school, the language of the siblings becomes English. And the language of response to the parents becomes English, right? And then some of us are commenting on the fact that there may be more than one language. There might be what we would call indigenous, I don't want to call them dialects, but they are indigenous languages. Dialects are different than languages. So a Chu as an indigenous language, and then Spanish as lingua franca of their country of origin, and then the US being English. And so we know that there's sort of a hierarchy in the current context where it's English, Spanish, Chu. And because it's the most minoritized language, this can sometimes disconnect parents and family members linguistically because they can't communicate as directly. I want to emphasize, though, that it's not that they don't communicate, it's just that they have to get really creative with how they connect with their kids and their family members. So I want you to think about this, and I want you to think about immigrants of color experience some of the most dramatic language shift of any other language group in our history, and that is mainly the Latino community. Think about this. We do not have an expectation that white European immigrants from Germany learn English as quickly. And if we look back to the turn of the century when we did have a lot of European migration to the US, we found that those languages stayed within families' households for 3 to 4 generations. But also, they were immigrants who were white and blended in with the majority culture. And therefore, they could masquerade as English speakers. You would look at them and not think anything. But I'm going to tell you the power of race, foregrounding language. We look at someone with a brown face and we make an immediate assumption that they speak Spanish. We make an assumption that they will have an accent, and we will make an assumption about their level of English proficiency. And this ascribes particular expectations to immigrants of color, where they need to acquiesce, assimilate as quickly as possible, and diminish and extinguish their L1, their L2 in favor of English. And so that is some of the rationale as to why language shift happens so dramatically for immigrants of color that live in your community. And also, we have this really profound realization that schools play a major role in heritage languages being evacuated from households. And so some of you shared that parents felt like, no, you're the expert, which we kind of go, at one point we think, thank you, and then, wow, that's an awesome responsibility. So you're thinking about a lot of really deep things here, and they don't have very concrete answers. And I want you to continue to think about reciprocity and what fosters that and what might restrict it.
Trish, I wanted to respond to the comments you were making about how English being the language of power and children of color being subjected to the language of power and losing their heritage language at a more alarming rate was not something we would see from immigrants that came from Europe that outwardly didn't look like immigrants. And I think about immigrants during the Great Famine in Ireland coming to the United States, that great influx, and those Irish immigrants did face lots of discrimination, especially in employment, thinking about signs that said no Irish need apply, and them being depicted as a having lawlessness. And I wonder how that compares to what our families are facing now, our families of color are facing now, and how is that different than what these European immigrants like the Irish might have experienced in the 1840s.
One of the things that we can think about, particularly with our European immigrants, is that when they came to the U.S., a lot of them were segregated in immigrant communities. And so they were segregated by language and race, ethnicity. And so, yes, the Irish did experience discrimination, right? They did experience less opportunities for higher levels of employment and had to live in pernicious poverty. But that wasn't, how shall I say, that was the first and second generations were impacted by that, but thereafter, the later generations weren't impacted by that as directly because there was one intermarriage, etc. The other thing that is significant about the Europeans that immigrated here, and we can think of the Cincinnati area not far from us, and that there was a strong German-speaking community. And the reason that it remained strong for as many generations as it did is because they had church communities to which they belonged. And these church communities had services in the L1 of German. So we also know that once World War II hit, the use of German became prohibited. And then English became pushed as more of the lingua franca and creating more harmony within the nation state, so to speak. So, so what we know about European immigrants is, yes, they did experience discrimination. But one of the things that should be known is that when they would walk into a room, someone would not necessarily ascribe them as being Irish or ascribe them as being lawless, as you state. But if an immigrant of color walks into a room and they are brown, there's an immediate assumption about who they are. If an Asian person walks into a room, there's an immediate assumption of who they are. So this is something that happens with Asian and Latinos, be them immigrants or US born, that they are ascribed as permanent foreigners regardless of how long they've been in the US. I am ascribed as an Asian foreigner even though I was born in San Francisco, California. My Latino colleagues are ascribed as foreigners even though they were born in Southern California. So, and what's interesting too is that sometimes students will not choose our sections because they think that we can't speak English. So this is not something that those that are in the racial majority experience, because the assumption always is that you speak English and I therefore have full access to you and the language of power. So because Asians and Latinos are ascribed as perpetual foreigners, that really puts pressure on them to acquiesce and learn the language and assimilate much more quickly.
So another reading that you have done this week is The Funds of Knowledge by Mole, Amante, Neff, and Gonzalez. And Amante and Neff are actually practitioners, whereas Mole and Gonzalez, pictured here, are scholars at the University of Arizona. So they take us a step further with multiliteracies, and they use the frame of funds of knowledge. And these are the historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skills that are essential for household or individual functioning and well-being. And more specifically, it honors families' knowledge as valid and important. It frames the knowledge as being additive and not as a deficit. It means something to the family. And also that this form of the funds of knowledge are also position knowledge as flexible, adaptive, and active, meaning that families are able to socially negotiate their particular context. And in so doing, they show wonderful resilience in how they appropriate access to knowledge for themselves and for the children in their family. So think about funds of knowledge and think about what you have perhaps discovered during your interview with your families.
Thinking about my interview with my family, I found two funds of knowledge that perhaps would be one, but just working on the entertainment industry and the arts industry. The mother had stated in our interview that her children were enrolled in formal Latin dance courses and dance classes, and also that she enjoys taking her kids to the cinema to see new movies that are coming out. And just naturally, I thought of connections that I could make to these students in ways that I hadn't before because of how much my husband and I love the movies, and also because of my passion for dance and watching different dance programs and things like that. But then it also made me think about what types of funds of knowledge they could have for some of our units, where we're working on informative pieces, where we're working on giving opinion pieces and writing reviews. Those could be natural ways that adapt to the family's current practices and current background knowledges, and specifically with the writing lessons that we complete in the standards that are assigned to us in third grade.
So, Stephanie, you're hitting upon all of these different activities that families are involved in, and how this has a particular discourse and a particular way of thinking that really revolves around sort of the notion of creation, which I know is part of your school's mission. So when you think about creation and creativity, in what ways is this demonstrating a new type of logic that can help us in schools?
One thing I learned about my focal student through the interview process was that English is taking over even in their household. My focal student is the youngest of three boys. He has a brother that's in his 20s, another brother who is at the middle school now, and then of course him. And as we spoke to mom, it became clear that she, being a monolingual Spanish speaker, was using Spanish with the boys in the home, but they were preferring to speak in Spanish, even to answer her questions or statements in Spanish. They want to watch English TV and listen to English radio. So while they are Spanish speakers, it sounds like the household itself may be more dominant English. I spoke with my focal student today because his middle brother did not attend school at my school, nor did the older brother, but that was before our dual immersion program existed. But the middle brother, being at the middle school now, could have been enrolled in our dual language program. And so I was asking my focal student, hey, why didn't your brother come to school here? And his response was, my brother doesn't like to talk Spanish. And that's how he said it. And I paused, and this was just, a quick conversation as we were transitioning from one task to another. But I stopped, and that stuck with me. As a native Spanish speaker, he is more comfortable using English, does not want to use Spanish. And I wanted to ask more, but I didn't want to put my focal student on the spot. Why doesn't he want to speak Spanish? Is it just because he's more comfortable with English, or is there something that some kind of negative association with Spanish? And it just made me wonder. And I thought that was really interesting. And as we are looking at the readings this week and the voice threads, I'm seeing that this is not uncommon to see. So that was just interesting and something that I'm running through my brain and trying to understand what to do with that information. As I was reading the article about funds of knowledge, on page 137, there was a statement that stuck with me that says at the bottom of the page, the teacher, not the anthropologist, who is ultimately the bridge between the student's world, theirs and their family's funds of knowledge, and the classroom experience. And I thought, wow, we are the bridge between them. But we're all running around like crazy trying to get as much information into the hands of the students as we can. Do we stop and pause to make sure we're bringing the students funds of knowledge, to make sure we're bringing the students into what we do every day, or are we just force feeding them curriculum? That's something that has been frustrating for me lately, and it's just with these courses, it's even more in the forefront of my mind that I don't get a chance to really get to know my students because it's run. You've got to learn this. We're in a hurry on this. We got to do this quickly. We don't have time to stop and breathe as teachers, and the students don't have time to stop and breathe and talk about the things that matter, not just academic knowledge, but the things that really matter in the world. So just things that are frustrating me, and I'm trying to figure out how I can steal back some of that time to bring the students and their funds of knowledge into the curriculum.
Christine LaMonica, you talked about how families are really, really holding on to their L1 and their heritage language as it connects really deeply to their identities, and how they really, really understand that if they let it go, that English will take over as the language of power. And others of you have noted that the language shift is very real within households. And depending on birth order, if the kids are younger, they are less proficient in Spanish than are perhaps their older siblings. And one thing that I find interesting, and this makes me think back to if I could use my focal student, which was one of the first students that I taught, named Emmanuel. And Emmanuel, his parents had two boys when they came from Mexico. They were older. They were, I think, in fourth or fifth grade when they started in school. And it was really difficult. They were in an English monolingual context. The kids were getting some ESL support, but they sensed that their children were really struggling, and they resolved that if they ever had more children, that they would only use English in the household going forward. So they had 2 more boys, and what they did is they shifted the language to English only. And what ended up happening is the mom and dad's proficiency in English isn't what we would regard as proficient. They wouldn't be a level 5 on WIDA. Let's just put it that way. And so what ended up happening is the language of the household actually became a combination of English and Spanish and an indigenous language, and it became this really rich translanguaging repertoire. And it was really beautiful. And I saw it operate in the house, and great connections were made, very direct connections of communication and love, and courage really happened in that setting. But when he came to school, he spoke this language that only he and his brother understood. And so for him, the mom made the decision to just get rid of Spanish altogether. And the result was sort of the hybriding of this language, which we could regard as a multiliteracy, which we could regard as a fund of knowledge, but it was not recognized as legitimate in the household. And I think many of you, or I'm sorry, it was legitimate in the household, but not legitimate in the school. And many of you have kids that are experiencing this language shift based on decisions that parents make or conditions by which the parents cannot control that occur that create these conditions for this swift shift. And so I want you to really think about that, about the ways that we may invalidate the shifts that happen in homes and the reasons that parents make the types of choices that they do. And in some cases, they are not choices. So think about what those blended repertoires of language look like in the household and how they're honored there, but perhaps not honored in the same way in schools, because we tend to honor English for sure. And we may honor Spanish because we've taken these classes and we are additively bilingual. But what do we think about as a funds of knowledge when kids translanguage and blend their languages like Emmanuel did?
So Mole and colleagues ask us to think a step deeper about what FOK means for us in our teaching. As you read through this article, one of the things they talk about is that teachers are in the role of the learner, right? Right now you're in the role of the learner because you are a student again, right? And this is a real place of vulnerability, discomfort, and sometimes conflict as we are adjusting what we historically thought and creating new avenues about how we can maybe think differently about things. So one of the things they do in their home visitation to identify funds of knowledge is that teachers have to suspend their historic thinking about what those homes may be like. In so doing, we create this relationship. We talked about reciprocity before, but they also call it symmetry with our families. And if we have symmetry with our families, our access with the families is much more complete, and it also gives us rich resources in which to inform our classroom practices. And also, when we have this particular frame of mind, we are mediators of learning versus the directors of learning. Meaning our students bring a lot of that content knowledge, a lot of academic language that is very sophisticated, the language of compare and contrast, the language of synthesis, the language of analysis, the language of regrouping, the language of examination. Those are all repertoires of language and literacy that they have. So with that, I leave you with some videos, and I am going to create additional slides here and put your names adjacent to them, inviting you to reflect on your particular slide and applying this principle of funds of knowledge. I'm going to share with you this one video of a child reading with her father in the language of Karen, which is one of the languages of Burma. And you'll see this bilingual exchange happening a really rich exchange between a father and a child. And so I want you to think about the languages and literacies and also the funds of knowledge that you see emerging from this exchange. And then on the slides that follow, I invite you to make direct comment with your small group members on what you are seeing. Take a look at the funds of knowledge represented in this video of a family reading aloud orally together and see what is transforming in this space.
What struck me the most about this particular video is the additive nature that was modeled with them sharing this reading. It wasn't framed as dad doesn't know English and is therefore uneducated. It was framed as them sharing this reading together and the student being bilingual and using both of her languages in order to share literacy together. So it was really a neat, really a beautiful example of how that additive nature, placing that value, honoring that value of the knowledge that both of them have and what they can create, co-create, co-construct.
So I love this video as well, and many of you that are in Logansport probably recognize this family because this is a Logansport family. So all of the videos that you're seeing are taken from family members in your community. And what I find beautiful about this is we see the oral transformation across multiple languages happening, both through print, both through oral language, across English, across Korean. It's really super. And so I love this relationship of symmetry that we see emerge with the child and her father. Emily, you also talked about, how we have learned, from the very beginning what additive bilingualism is, and how how families feel this sense of desperation, particularly with your focal student, as you talk about the aunt who is like, I'm not going to give up these languages for my nephew. I'm going to hang on to them. And I'm going to tell you that this resolve to hang on is super powerful because it connects with her identity. It connects with her relationship, staying tied with her nephew, and she does not want to lose that. And her recognition of the language of power is a powerful form of resistance where she's saying, no, no, go away, because she probably knows what will happen if she does make the shift. One of the things that we know, and I always remember this quote, somebody shared this with me, and this was in relationship to the Native American or First Nations communities and the loss of their languages, which is happening at rapid speed, where these languages are becoming more abound, meaning they're in their last generation of speakers. But the quickest way to get rid of a language is to build roads. I want you to think about that. The quickest way to get rid of a language is to build roads. So as soon as we bring in the new to generate bilingualism, then that first language changes, something changes. And then the other language, the dominant language, changes too. And so when I think about this mom, that this aunt that's saying no, 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 no English, right? I don't think she's saying no, no, no to bilingualism. I think what she's saying is, I don't want to lose. I do not want this road. I do not want the collision of loss. And so I think this aunt is brilliant.
Trish, I appreciate you sharing that quote with us. I had the privilege of being able to go on our school's trip to Ecuador last year over the summer. And I will forever remember as well our tour guide talking about the southern part of Ecuador and there not being any roads there until, I think she said, last 20 years. And so lots and lots of indigenous communities in Ecuador. And these people were not connected to the rest of Ecuador, good, bad, or otherwise. So when you said that, I immediately thought about the information in Ecuador and how these people were somewhat isolated, but then their community was more whole in some ways. So I definitely connected to what you were saying.
So one of the things I think we all need to sort of have as a takeaway here is that whenever there is language shift or language change, as you identified through your Multiliteracies project, that we have to appreciate that that loss comes with some sacrifice, and that loss also can be something that they really feel very deeply. But I wanna still stay situated in that they're not losing, things are shifting, but in that shifting, there is great complexity, and this sense of holding on. And so that's not stubbornness, that is a form of brilliance or a fund of knowledge. Take a look at this video of a bilingual reading session that's going on between two little girls.
So, a couple things I noticed after watching the video. The first book, it appeared to be like a bilingual book that maybe had English and Spanish text on the page. And it was interesting to me that the girl who sat and read the whole time appeared to be older, but she seemed to have more ease in reading the English than she did the Spanish. And the girl who looked younger, who was gone for most of the video, um, you know, was easily able to switch back and forth and was even, not only reading the words for her, but, eventually explaining some of the words to her as well, which I thought was really interesting. In the second book, I couldn't really tell if it was, another bilingual book or if it was just in Spanish, since the who I assume was the mother was reading the Spanish to her. But I was just curious because some of the word order when the girl was, replying to the mom in English with what the page said, it didn't seem like the word order was necessarily correct for English all the time. So I just wondered about that. But I thought that was really cool that the mom was, that book that they read at the beginning was in both languages. So, whichever language she was more comfortable in, since she was hearing it in both, like it gave her an opportunity to understand or like comprehend, I suppose, what she was reading in both languages. So whichever, language was easier for her, she could, she was able to comprehend it through at least one of the languages. And I also thought the mom was a really good support. She sat and helped her and just, supported her through that. But I thought, what a cool way for that child who maybe is not in a bilingual program at school or, something similar. What a cool way to, still practice her Spanish reading skills at home. And, make it more of a family reading instead of just the child reading.
I found it interesting that at the beginning of the video, when reading the book that was in both English and Spanish, the sibling was piping in with help on words, but it wasn't just one of the languages that she was piping in on. Sometimes she was offering her sister a Spanish word, sometimes she was offering her sister an English word. I liked when mom came in and started reading with the girl that you could tell that the girl was using visual clues. She was looking at the pictures in the story. She was making connections. I also liked how it seems like she kept catching herself on the word for big dog every single time she was saying it in Spanish. And she would turn to her mom for reinforcement on if she was saying it correctly or not. I found it interesting when mom started to read the Clifford book in Spanish to the girl and she began translating it, that you could again see that the girl was using visual clues to help her to know what was going on in parts of the story. Some she was very quick with knowing the words, some she had to think about. I loved how mom gave the reinforcement of words, so the girl would translate some, and then many times it was the verbs that mom was repeating for her. So I thought that was, that's a strategy that we use at school. So I was glad to see that it was a strategy that mom is also using at home, because that's showing that bridge between school and home and how the learning is happening in both places. Ellen, I'm glad that you made the comment about the word order when the girl was translating the Clifford book because her mom was reading it to her in Spanish. That was one thing that I noticed as well. And honestly, I kind of chuckled to myself on that one. One, because she was audibly saying what runs through my head. I know enough Spanish that I can, for the most part, translate a Clifford book probably. Some coursework level in Spanish, no, probably not, but a Clifford book I could do. But what she was saying out loud is exactly what goes on in my head as I'm reading the Clifford book. But also the fact that this connects to what we've been talking about all along, that these kids that are speaking a different language, they take in the English, they translate it in their heads to their home language, then they've got to translate it back to English to give us a response. And that's exactly what she was doing there. I could tell she has the strong sense of English, and she was repeating everything in the word order in Spanish but giving it back in English. So basically she's proving what we've been talking about here, and where all this time I've really just thought about how English must be confusing for these kids that speak a different language, because they're going to be basing everything off of Spanish word order. And I'm not so sure that that's what she was doing here. I'm interested to know what her L1 is.
So I think most of us are really struck by how the younger girl seems to have more biliterate proficiency, and that she's younger. So why is this? So I think one of the things that you learn that once your kids enter school, and you should know that the kid that was the main reader of the book in the very beginning of the video is the older child, and she is school-aged, whereas the younger kid is not quite school-aged yet. And when does language shift happen? Language shift happens to be more English dominant when what? When they enter school. So we see this phenomenon, whereas the younger child is at home with mom and is being read to in Spanish and in English. And so you can see how this back and forth kind of goes on with mom and young child, like the young child with mom during the day, whereas the older child is in school and is focusing on developing her reading in English. So it's interesting that we see this bilingualism more with the younger child. But what is that going to look like in a couple of years when she's as old as her sister is now? So this is evidence of what we call language shift. And we see that more so with the older kid because the kid is school aged. Take a look at this book reading that's happening between a parent and their older child who's already in school and a younger one who's quite not in school just yet. Notice the language use and notice the symmetry.
The symmetry in this reading was absolutely beautiful. I love even just the position of the child. She's in the middle. They're both there to talk to her on either side. So they can all see the book. They're all side by side. They're all reading together. I love that the older brother and the mom read together at sometimes, and sometimes, he took the English and she talked in Spanish. I love the comprehension in that mom talked to her about things that were in the text, even saying, well, what does that mean? Tell me about what that means in Spanish. And then they looked at the pictures and she was talking about things that weren't necessarily in the words, but that were being shown in the pictures, and how that informed what the words were saying. I love that. And then at the end, I liked how the older brother would speak in English and in Spanish together, and she would supply the word for him, and they were still using it to discuss. And just the seamless transition between the two languages, and yet they all completely understood. I think it was absolutely wonderful to see how, how deep that conversation went with such a simple book, allowing her to get a greater understanding and to see her understanding in both languages there.
Thanks, everybody. So we were, as a research team, flies on walls as we collected all of these videos, of which we have 25 different families from 5 different school corporations throughout Indiana, one of which is yours. And Annie, this wonderful vignette that you just observed is actually a Lafayette family. I can't tell you what schools they're from, but what I find really poignant in this, not only the funds of knowledge that we see, but we see mom who is Spanish dominant. We see the little child in the middle who is not quite school aged yet. And so she still speaks sort of her mother tongue. And then we see the older child who is now in school, and I believe he's a 4th or a 5th grader. And so he has more of a repertoire of English at this point. So you can see how this negotiation goes back and forth. And you can see him saying el tree, and the mom says arbol, which is a form of error correction, but she doesn't say you're wrong. She just repeats the word in Spanish, and he eventually adopts it. So what's neat is we see really this continuum. And so it's almost like we see mom as first teacher on the left, child as adopter of mother tongue, and then son on the other continuum, end of the continuum, representing schooling, right? And schooling is a very, very powerful influence on language shift, and also in any types of shifts that kids make. Schools ask kids to really shift, and sometimes you have to ask yourself, are these shifts helpful? Do these shifts perhaps unnecessarily create frictions within their households? So take a look at this reading exchange between a dad and his daughter as they exchange a language other than Spanish and English.
Seeing this video really helped connect me to my family case study. So my mom that I interviewed, she feels really strongly that she wants her kids to maintain their L1, and they still understand it. They hardly ever speak it unless it's with people who don't understand English. So when they go to Mexico, she mentioned that some family members still don't know much English, so the kids will use it with them. But that's only once a year or so. So I think this video shows that mom can still help her kids maintain their Spanish by reading to them. And then, if they're still refusing or really reluctant to use Spanish, they can translate what they heard in Spanish to English. So it's really great practice. So it's not just conversational, but it's also in a storytelling setting. My mom also mentioned that she was afraid of her kids because they all struggle with reading. She said that she's concerned about confusing them. And I think this just goes to show you that this is a bridge between that, to help her get her desires of them keeping their L1 and becoming better readers and with that support at home and not have that confusion. But in fact, that L1 can help make them stronger readers. And so I think I'm going to share this video with her and this strategy with her.
Watching this video was really amazing. I think it's all of our hopes that this is what's happening in all of our families, English only, and all of our ELLs, of course. I think this is a great example of biliteracy in the home. I love how they use both their L1 and English while reading. The mom that I interviewed talked about kind of a similar experience with her children while they read. She talked about how she reads to the kids in Spanish, and then they will teach her some of the words in English while she's reading. So she says they're like her little teachers, and I just thought this was a nice experience that they share together.
Thanks, Amy, Rachel, LaMonica, and Jeannie for your additions. One of the things I shared on the other slide was this whole notion of families sort of resisting the dominant language or the majority language, which in this context is English, and really holding fast to the maintenance of their heritage language. And to me, this really forecast a really deep sense of understanding and deep sense of resistance. And resistance is not being a bad person. Resistance is usually not someone being stubborn. They have a reason, because they know that once you introduce that language, that something will change with your heritage language. And so that can, families who don't want to lose that will have this resolve to continue to maintain and develop the L1 in the household and the community, because they know that when they go to school, that's not going to be the case. One thing, too, I want you to think about, and it's related to language shift, and this is related to the Native American community, which we read about in Joel Spring's work at the beginning of the semester, in our first class, I should say. And what we learned there, and this is a quote that I'll long remember, is that the best way to get rid of a language or to shift a language is to build roads. And so if you think about students and schools, the distance between their child's home and the school is a road, and that road connects them to English, and then that English goes back with them. And with that English comes change. Their Spanish changes, their identities change, their connectivity with their families changes and transforms. And so that can come with sadness, with grief, stubbornness, resolve to hang on to their language heritage and their identities.
In one of our next readings, we look at the work of Murillo and his whole notion of the linguistic bricolage, right? So this is representative of a range of literacies and languages that are practiced by our bilingual families. And also the ways in which this language and literacy is expressed is often done in first person in something that is widely known in the literature as testimonios, right? And it's a narration of a socially significant experience. Some of us might call it storytelling or providing episodes of something of importance, right? But when we hear this sort of testimonial, we regard families as significant holders of language and literacies, and it's not just the school that possesses that. So what I'm going to do next, again, is provide you with another related video of the linguistic bricolage. And I'd like you to connect Maria's work to what you're seeing in the video. You'll see that the next few slides are repetitive. Just look for your name and respond on your respective slide.
Take a look at this translation event that emerged from an interview and now is represented as the mother and the son sort of imagine what this scenario would look like in a store. Notice the language exchange.
I agree with Jessica that I definitely see the translation here that a lot of kids have to do that for their parents. And I think that it shows really well that he has a good understanding of how those things translate. And I think it's really interesting too, because you can tell he isn't quite sure. Like at first it seems like he's really not quite sure what she's actually asking for. Like he may not know the thing. He may not be able to picture the thing. It might be something that he hasn't had to use that she wants to get. And I think that's really interesting that he's still able to convey that message, even though he may not have that thought. But he did know, he was like, oh no, it's not to clean it. It's so that it doesn't smell bad. So he kind of had an understanding of, exactly what it was for. He may just not have used one himself. And I thought that was awesome because it shows the extent to his understanding. And I think that, for me, it connected a lot with, the example that was, in the article of, a girl that they said that she had, been introduced to books and things, even though she was kind of behind. And so they were amazed at how much she had been exposed to because they weren't expecting it. And that she was keeping, track of household things. I'm trying to find the page number, but I don't see the page number. It's page 21. How she kept track of tasks and she kept track of appointments and things like that, that sometimes those things overlap and those things become, a child's responsibility because they have to be the intermediary. And I thought it was really cool to see that they could work together on that.
Thanks everybody for your additions. One of the things that we know about with something called the linguistic bricolage and the roles that the children play with their families, I have heard educators, adults, teenagers say that I've heard this, and it's going to sound really abrasive, but that's a form of child abuse because you're asking your child to communicate something when you should just learn English and just do it. But I think what that does is it forecloses on the capacity and the richness that the child contributes to the family in a way that is reciprocity, and that's just what you do within that family. And the role that this child is taking on, and you can hear Annie in the background kind of facilitating this, but this came up in their interview with us, is that they talked about how their children help in the grocery store. And so they have to listen to their parent about what they need and describe it. And then they have to come up with the right words. And you can see how this is getting negotiated with this little boy, where he's saying, no, it's not soap. It's just this thing so you can make it smell better. And you can hear this back and forth going on. And so this is what we would call a negotiation that goes on between parent and child. But scholars will also call it like the interlocutor, where they sort of sit between the spaces of what their parent needs and what they need to request of the store person. And you see how rich this is. This goes beyond translation, goes beyond interpretation. And by the way, interpretation is spoken exchanges. This interpretation is deeply negotiated. And that's why we call it the role of the interlocutor. And I'm going to tell you, this is a very, very, very specific skill. It's really, not only is it beautiful, but it's also something that kids his age who are monolingual may not be asked to do because their circumstances don't have that type of role. But you can see the maturity and the confidence by which that he embodies in this particular exchange. So it's super rich. So Mary, Jessica, Jennifer, Amanda, Ellen, and Jesse, you're going to be posting on this slide. And I want you to notice what emerges as the families imagine what this transaction would look like in a store. This was based on something that they had talked about earlier. And Annie, you can hear in the background, is asking them to reenact this.
So I think this is kind of a good description or an explanation of what's happening in a lot of our homes. I see a lot of my students translate for parents, but you can see like how hard he has to think and focus and concentrate. And you can also see the giggling, which I see a lot of. And I think sometimes that's a confidence thing. They're not always sure. Maybe even kind of like it gives them a time to think more about exactly what they're trying to say. So they kind of giggle through it a little bit. But you can see that he has to focus because he can understand what she's saying, but he's struggling expressing exactly what she's saying to him. So I feel like this is kind of common. What goes on in a lot of our homes is that sometimes the kids, they can understand, but then they have a hard time expressing or being able to say exactly what their parent was trying to say to them. And they're having to go back and forth between listening to Spanish and then speaking in English, and I can only imagine how difficult that is. So it's taking them a little bit of time to process. Um, and it seems kind of like he doesn't necessarily have the vocabulary of the words that he's trying to say in English or Spanish. And he has to ask his mom, and I loved how she was kind of giving him hand gestures and little signals and kind of trying to explain with her hands and show him exactly what she was saying. But you could definitely see how hard he had to think to go back and forth between Spanish and the English.
So I was way excited to open up the video link and see something that I can totally connect to that I was assigned to here. I also have a second job working in a grocery store. And it's actually a fruit, meat, and flower market here in town. And I work on Sunday mornings and then through the summers. And I'm a cashier. Um, so one of the things that our market has is a large selection of Hispanic goods. So we have a lot of families that come in there for their baking and cooking needs. And I see these kinds of conversations going on often. The kids come in, just even the adults coming in, and the conversations that we have to have back and forth. And sometimes, I'll be honest, I'm not able to figure out exactly what it is they're looking for. And so I call on my boys, Jesus and Pablo, over in produce, and they can come and help me out a lot of times. And we are very lucky to have them because that's what, well, it isn't always the situation like what was in the video where you've got a child that's trying to translate for their family members. That's what we literally put Jesus and Pablo on opposing shifts on the weekends. One boy works the morning, one works the afternoon. So we always have a kid that can come over and translate for us if need be. We also have a full-time employee that is in charge of the ordering and the stocking and the preparing of the goods for this section of our produce and then the aisle in our grocery store. So she's also available to help us. And then a lot of our carry-out kids are also bilingual. So I would say in my 6-hour weekly shift, I'm seeing this kind of conversation going on right in front of me multiple times as we help our customers to find the goods they need, to check out, and then to communicate with them because we are a fruit and meat market, many of the things they bag and pack themselves and stuff, especially with the Hispanic goods that they can buy in there. So, I've become well versed in knowing the difference between the different kinds of peppers and spices and things like that they can buy. But then it's also my job to converse with them to make sure that I am charging them the correct price for things. So, I honestly, through this experience, it's something that I picked up just for some extra money so that I could put a new roof on my house. But I have kept the job because it's something fun to do with my limited spare time, but also because I see a whole different side of the different cultures in my community by interacting with them through this grocery store experience.
So, Jessica, one of the things that you end with is we kind of think of them that this whole exchange is what we call the interlocutor, that they are thinking about what is the source message? What does my mom want? How do I convey this to the clerk? I'm not sure if it's dish soap or flavors or something that it's something to do with smelling. And you can see that he eventually gets this point conveyed to Annie, who is conducting the interview. The thing is that we often think about interpretation events, and this is an interpretation event because it involves speaking and listening, and translation is print, right? So don't call this an event of translation. This is an event of interpretation. And so I think it's really key to think about spoken interpretation is really different than writing. With writing, we tend to be more concrete and literal, where red is rojo and the la fecha is the date, y es noviembre, el 5 de noviembre, it's the 5th of November, right? But when we're doing interpretation, interpretation isn't I say one thing, then you say one thing, right? It's this back and forth. So you notice that they went back and forth, and he eventually was able to convey what he wanted to convey in English. So I think that's what's super important when we think about this is it isn't like mom talks, child expresses precision out. It is this negotiation that goes back and forth until he's finally able to convey what his mom is trying to say. So this takes time. So let's think about our parent-teacher conferences. How long do we let those go on? Do we give, if you have 20 minutes for every family, does that mean that you have 20 minutes plus interpretation time for every family? And does that mean that your Spanish speaking families have a shorter period of time because there's a lot of this negotiation going back and forth? And I'm going to tell you that when you do interpretation, like a parent at like an event where you pass the mic back and forth, it seems like message one, translate, message two, translate. But this is really different because there's the back and forth. And when there's the back and forth, like you have in a parent-teacher conference, right, it takes longer, right? And the reason that it takes longer is the child is trying to figure out the source message. What does mom want? And then they're also trying to find the right words to convey that to the English clerk. So I never knew that there was this type of product of having something that goes down the drain to make things smell good. I've never heard of this type of thing before, ever. So, if I was asked, if mom was explaining this to me, I would have struggled in the same way that the boy did. But I want you to think about the back and forth is so the child conveys the source message appropriately. Marie, Christy, Amy, Jessica, and Stephanie, take a look at this video clip. This emerges from some data that we had collected earlier as a mom talked about how she manages language differences in stores. And take a look at the role that the Sunbreak takes on and look at the negotiation. How is this representative of bricolage?
I'm interested in this concept of the interlocutor that Trish has mentioned on several slides with other groups, and this student having to be that go between the store worker and the family. And I think about the students in my building who are dominant English, who would be monolinguals had they not been involved in our dual language environment. And families ask many times when we're in meetings like parent-teacher conferences, can they speak Spanish? How well do they speak Spanish? Because these English-speaking families don't know how proficient the student is in Spanish. And so my Spanish counterpart will say, oh yeah, they have great Spanish. And the family will explain that they're not really using Spanish at home, and they're not really using Spanish in in the community. And so a couple of things come to my mind. First, these students have a choice as to whether to use that second language in the community, whereas our ELs don't often, because they have to serve in that role as an interlocutor for their family in order to function and to be that bridge. So I start thinking about privilege, as some of our students have. But the second question that comes to my mind is, should these families be pushing these students, these Spanish language learners, to use those Spanish skills in the community, or should they just let the students use them when they feel comfortable? Should they push, or should they wait?
Thanks, Jessica, for talking about your context in a dual language program, a dual language bilingual education program where you have a purposeful blend of English speakers and Spanish speakers in your room, and they spend half their day with you in English and half their day with your partner teacher in Spanish. And so they get their full curriculum and across 2 different languages throughout the day. So in this particular model, you mentioned that you have English speakers that come out of the program by the time they're in 5th grade with you, where they have what teachers would regard as relative or quite good proficiency in Spanish. Yet they're not really forced to use that Spanish outside of the home unless the parents invite them to do so, or they're in a context that might be multilingual that would encourage them or create a context in which they would use their Spanish. And then you remark upon our Spanish speakers, where they fall into this role of interlocutor, often because of need, because of request of a parent, right? But I think the big thing you're also talking about is that should the students self-direct that, or should the parents make them do that or push them to do that? And I think this is the thing, is that would be a great follow-up question for your focal family, is when they think about their child as the interlocutor, is that something that the kid just does, um, uh, in relationship to their parent, because it's something that not only their parent needs, but they may need it too. If they're needing to find something in the meat aisle because they're going to make dinner, I mean, that benefits the child as well. They're going to eat that food, right? So I don't know that when we think about the interlocutor, right, and the roles that kids play, particularly in kids who are Hispanic and Latinx, who are not often privileged like most of the English majority speakers in your classroom, Jessica, where they really can just pick and choose when they use it, which it means they probably won't. Um, they probably won't purposely use Spanish outside of the school context. Um, so, but I think what we see with this kiddo going back and forth with his mom trying to figure things out, what we need to focus on is that there's a great negotiation between parent and child and the source message to convey the meaning um, to the store clerk. And in so doing, there's a lot of significant learning going on with language, with interpretation skills, and really, really understanding more deeply what mom is getting at. Um, so the sense of coercion, I think we have to ask our kids if they feel like they're being pushed to do so. My take on that is that I'm not sure that that's the case. Using the notion of Maria Murillo's linguistic bricolage, take a look at this event that is being reenacted between a son and his mom, related to how they would negotiate finding something very technical in the grocery store.
This video was also awesome to see. I've had the privilege, I've taught fourth and fifth grade for most of my career. So before I worked in California, and we didn't have a lot of money to pay for translators for parent-teacher conferences, and we had a huge EL population, so I mostly relied on students back then to do the translating for me. And I see now how obviously this is a huge strength for them. And then the previous video we watched, where we watched the girl translate without even looking at the text, just listening to what her dad was saying. And this shows from the article from Morello, is that his name? From Morello's article, that it says that kids who are translating for their parents, it really strengthens their English. Where is it? The act of translating has been shown to help children develop strong literacies in both languages. So that shows that we can value their L1, of course, along with learning English. And I think this is something that my parent, during my case study, was saying how she was worried about confusing her son. But there's these two things that I can go back and tell her that's actually going to strengthen his reading comprehension if he is exposed to his L1 as much as possible.
I think all of you are remarking upon the resilience of the child, the creativity of the child, and the capacity of the child to negotiate with his parent across what is needed. Whereas we can go to a grocery store and describe very directly, I need this thing, and it's the thing that you put in the drain so it doesn't smell bad, and bam, we're directed right away. Whereas she has to work with her child, but in so doing, it's a form of teaching, where the child becomes aware of what this item is and what it's called in English, and therefore he's creating that access point for his mother and also for him down the road. But the role of the interlocutor, in a previous slide with another group of teachers, they were talking about our parents really pushing their kids to do this when they may or may not want to do it. And in this particular situation, this is again a bit orchestrated in the sense that it came up in a previous interview. So we asked the mom to follow up about how her son, negotiated the situation. And she says, yeah, he frequently does, but it also meets the needs of the child too, right? For instance, if a child is being asked to negotiate getting a particular cut of meat at the meat counter, that's going to benefit the child as well, right? That meal is going to eventually be on his plate. So there's a negotiation of what would meet the need of the family versus the need of just the child or just the mother. And so there's a real collectivism here that is not necessarily coercion, but it shows the resilience and the creativity of the child.
So when we think about the linguistic bricolage and its connection to funds of knowledge, one of the things that Murillo invites us to do is to think about how this bricolage is built in homes, communities, churches, and even stores. And you could even add to that list. And the methods that we use is by observing in families and also doing something called bracketing. Bracketing means that we attempt to suspend our prior perceptions, our prior ideas, or what we call ideologies of what families can and cannot do. We also observe family and community events and conduct in-depth family interviews. And so you've attended to some of that with your family interview, and certainly you've been to family and community events. And perhaps you've been in contexts where you had to be the observer, meaning again, you were the learner, right? Which is what Mo and Gonzalez invite us to do. Our last reading comes from Louie and Davis Melton, who talk about family literacies project. I call it the Family Multiliteracies Project. And it's all about the bilingual book creation and how children across their language differences can co-create these books and make it a rich literacy experience. So there's a couple of questions that Louie and Davis Melton invite us to do, and they have this section called Pause and Ponder. So I'm going to put two of these pieces up here and invite you to talk about is how can we leverage Yale's cultural experiences to enrich the literacy curriculum, and how can our classrooms, be more inclusive to engage culturally and linguistically diverse students. So I'd invite you to post here as well.
One unit that my team has been using, I guess, kind of January, February, we're finishing that up, is using materials with Kid Congress. If you're not familiar with Kid Congress, it's the next chapter in Kid President. So if you're not familiar with either of those, look them up online. They're great videos for socio-emotional learning, kind of advice for kids and adults. And there's actually lesson plans that are already created to go with them. One particular video talked about the importance of words and how your words can affect others. So after we watched the video and had our discussion, the students were challenged to write a letter to someone that they wanted to share that they cared about them, or share that they wanted to encourage or whatnot. So we worked together in groups. Well, first we worked together and brainstormed as a class some people at school that we might want to write a letter for. And then the students grouped themselves based on who they wanted to write to co-create this letter. I had several students ask me, can I do this piece in Spanish? And I said, absolutely. So I said some students working in Spanish, some students working in English, and they were able to co-create that based on what they felt like was best for their group. Just the permission to use Spanish seemed to take some weight off of some of my students and give them, more of them, a chance to be involved. So it was definitely something that I'd like to do more of.
I'm going to mirror everyone else and say that definitely including their experiences, that letting them share it, not just to you, not just to the teacher, but to the classroom. I like the idea of the holidays. I have a student who doesn't celebrate any holidays, and she is Hispanic, and I think she feels left out a lot. We talk a lot about comparing and contrasting, and we have her come up and say, well, what did you guys do at home? What do you do? We would love to hear about what you do. Your family is, just as important as all of ours. And she really likes to share what they did. Well, we stayed home and we spent time together, or we went to church. And I think it's really good to have that representation and to make it not seem different in a bad way, that everyone is accepting of all of everyone's differences, because that's what's awesome about us. I think that sometimes we, tell me about that or write about that, but it's just between the teacher and the student, and it doesn't make it as meaningful as when all the students share. We have community circle every day as well, and we use a lot of that time to talk about cultural differences and things that they do, and say, oh yeah, my family does that too, or oh no, we don't, we do something a little different, or oh, that sounds like something my friend does. And it just helps them get closer as well as to feel represented. We do a lot of this around language as well in my classroom, because we talk a lot about cultural differences in our dialects, I guess, in the way that people are speaking. That, oh, here we might commonly say this word, but in Mexico it's different. And then in another country that's different too. What does your family say? And so we talk a lot about that too, that there's millions of different acceptable words, and they're all worth learning and worth using because they're words that people know and use in their own cultures.
The unit that I'm currently working on in our reading book is on traditional tales. In 2 weeks ago, the last 2 weeks, last week and the week before, we read a play called La Culebra, and it's a Mexican folk tale. It honestly worked out well. We ended up doing 2 weeks worth of it because we had a 4-day weekend and that turned into a 5-day weekend due to weather. So I just decided to continue on with activities, and we were able to read the story a second time and whatnot. So anyway, I think first of all, when we started out, because it's a play, we needed to go through all of the different characters and discuss them. And I let my kids know, you're going to need to help me. I don't know how to say each of these words. And then we would discuss what each word meant in English so that others could understand. We talked about how some of the words, for instance, the word used in the play for farmer was different than any of my kids knew. That's not the word that they used for farmer. It also led to an interesting opportunity, and I might have brought up already in a different voice thread or something about during this play with my kids 2 weeks ago. But I had one of my English only students that was like, well, I can't read this part. It's in Spanish. How am I supposed to read Spanish? And so we had a whole discussion about how, we can all give new languages a try, basically. But what really excited me was one of my students was very excited to see that it was a play from Mexico because that is where his family is from. And it just so happened that grandma was visiting from Mexico. So he had asked if he could take his book home, his reading book home. And I, of course, told him yes, he could. And so today we talked about it, and he said that over the weekend he was able to share the story with his grandma and his aunt, who was also visiting. And I asked him if his grandma knew the story, and she did, but his aunt did not know the story. And so he was able to sit down with his grandma and have a conversation about what she knew about this story and what he had learned with what we had done at school. So, it really empowered him. And he is one of my students that is Johnny on the spot with answers. He knows exactly what's going on. He can give me the most fabulous oral answers, but he struggles when it comes to reading the story himself. Um, so this was super exciting for him that he was so familiar with this story, and it was something that he was able to share with his grandma. And then his grandma was also able to share back with him the cultural views on the play and how the story had been passed down through time according to how she had heard it growing up.
I'd invite you to look at the related videos here and again post on your related on the slide where your name is attached. This next portion of the voice thread is regarding a study that our team at Purdue has done related to the family multiliteracies. And we conducted questionnaires and interviews with our partners La Plaza and also Goshen College and our team at Purdue. And so we looked at these 6 areas, and if you notice, they're the 6 areas that you just investigated with your families. So across 5 different school districts, we found many different things in these 6 areas, and I'm going to share those initial findings with you now. So using a representative subset from our larger scale study, we found that all parents spoke to their child in Spanish, and all children first spoke Spanish when they first began to speak. But not surprisingly, the siblings speak to each other in English. So they may interact with their parents in one language, but speak to their siblings in another. So this is the phenomenon of growing up in an English dominant context or a language dominant context, is that the language seeps in. And so we see that the use, as generations move forward, we see what we call language shift. So this is what we found.
After my interview, these were my findings as well. The family I talked to said that they only spoke Spanish to their child, and he only spoke Spanish at first, but then started responding more and more in English. And he now only speaks English when he's talking to his siblings. I found this really interesting. I guess I just assumed that if the parents are speaking Spanish to the kids, then the children would be speaking Spanish to each other as well. And I just figured he was mostly using English at school and with his English-speaking friends. His mom said she encourages Spanish, but he likes to speak in English. She, like a lot of other Spanish-speaking families, fears that he will lose his language, and that's a big reason for putting him in the dual language program at school.
So after my case study interview, I can definitely see this language shift. So my focal student is the oldest in his family. He's 10, and he had zero English, well, little to no English spoken to him during his first 4 years of life, and then he entered preschool. His mom said that she didn't want to really do anything with English because she knew that he would learn it as soon as he got to school, which of course he did. Then she has two other children. One is in second grade, I believe she's 7, and then the baby is 4. And that trickle down is just pretty fascinating, because my focal student only spoke English to started speaking English to his little sister when she was at about age 1, when he entered preschool. And then the baby is 4, and he has only been spoken to in English by both of his siblings. So he's had the easiest time transitioning into preschool. So that language shift is just so evident so quickly, just in this small little family of 5.
Thanks to all of you. You're really remarking upon how schools, American schools, have a very, very big role to play in language shift happening rather quickly within one generation, and that's that supports research nationally that the Latinx population, their language shift is happening more rapidly than really any other immigrant subgroup in our nation's history.
Another key finding from our study, representative of the 5 districts in this class, is that all parents want their children to be bilingual and biliterate. And their primary reason for bilingualism and biliteracy is for a better career, better opportunities, but also for their cultural identity. So they are able to communicate with grandparents. So they are able to connect with their heritage. And that positive identity formation was really important to families. And they identify that the main strategy for raising bilingual children is speaking Spanish in the home and being very vigilant about that language use in the household so it was retained. And in some cases, families identify that they learn from other families and other relatives that the lack of Spanish in the home over time meant that there was a growing disconnect between children and parents, specifically in the area of language, as children experience what you call a rapid language shift, which then leads to language loss over time. And so parents, not all parents, but many parents were really persistent in maintaining Spanish in the household.
In my experience, my parents were also ones who raised my brother and I only speaking Spanish at home for the same reason that they didn't want us to lose our cultural identity. Um, Growing up in Indiana as a kid, I can think of all the kids who spoke Spanish in my whole grade, and they are still friends of mine. And of course, now Logansport has become much more diverse, but back then, it was diverse, but not as much as it is now. And whenever we'd visit family in California or in Mexico, especially in California, since my dad's side of the family lives over there, but whenever I'd visit my grandparents in California, I'd always only ever speak Spanish to them, and they always wondered how my parents did it, how my brother and I were we're very fluent in Spanish when my cousins who grew up there couldn't really even speak it well to them. They spoke it very broken. They still speak it very broken to my grandparents and use a lot more English than they do Spanish. And all my aunts and uncles were very, I guess, shocked that my brother and I could speak Spanish so well, just because the demographic over here isn't like it is in Los Angeles, where Spanish is spoken everywhere and everyone around you is speaking Spanish. So I can totally agree with this slide about keeping our cultural identity and how much it really means to us, especially when communicating with older generations in our family.
Thanks, Jocelyn, for really talking about this in first person as a heritage speaker of Spanish, and how your parents had a really strong resolve to keep your language intact in the household, which contributed to your proficiency in the language, but also in maintaining your identity. But even within the same family, and thinking about your cousins and your uncles and aunts, and how they may have made different choices in the home. Also, in a place like Los Angeles, where there's a heavy Latino population, there's all different varieties of Spanish that are going on in that community, as well as all different varieties of English. So think about what would be the other influences beside family and schools that might have contributed to your cousin's rapid language shift, where they are perhaps not as proficient in Spanish as you are. So these are the types of literacies or multiliteracies that emerged in the household based on our questionnaires, interviews, and video captures of our families across all of the districts that are represented in this section. So the first was print literacy, which generally came from school. Media literacy, which includes things such as tablets, which we found an abundance of, versus laptops or desktops, particularly smartphones and televisions. And school literacies, which were connected to print literacies, and created literacies, and how all of these things intersected, where families created their own literacies. So one of the things that we discovered is in one of our communities, we found that families that spoke indigenous languages other than Spanish would go to the church mass. They would listen to the service in Spanish, and then afterwards they would gather with others from their indigenous community. And with the priest, they would negotiate what the priest was saying. And they would do that in their heritage indigenous language. And so this was quite a lengthy process, but it demonstrated their commitment to understanding the source message and how it took multiple parties to do so. But in so doing, it wasn't what you call a transliteration, where you take this from Spanish and you turn it into another language, or you take this from English and you turn it into another language, similar to what we talked about in week 5 related to testing. Really, it is something that was richly negotiated. So one of the things that I think is important to think about when we think about created literacies, think about all the ways that you count literacy, be it homework, assignments, activities, and in what ways can created literacies be representative and demonstrate that our families are doing something with our families. It just may not be in ways that we understand. But what we did find with created literacies is that they were exceptionally creative. They took cognitive demand, they were difficult, and they took time, and our families negotiated them and did them. Y los deseos. What our parents, what our families wish schools would be thinking about. Paciencia was a common construct that repeated itself again and again, that teachers need to show more paciencia. Very simply, that is patience, but paciencia in Espanol is, and also in the context of being teachers and learners of this concept, is that paciencia is much bigger than just being patient, because patience involves understanding and connection. And that's what the parents were trying to express to schools. And then also we found that families would be inclined to have more bilingual teachers and paraprofessionals, and they would really enjoy having that for their children. So that's all for Family Multiliteracies. Thank you for engaging in this important work as we extend our notion of academic language from the school to our homes and communities.